need that TV!
Attention shoppers, please do not run!
Where are the consoles?
Black Friday was always an oddity for me. I'd worked my share of chaotic shifts in my old life, dealing with people acting like animals for a discounted toaster. But as an Uber driver, you don't see the frenzy directly. You see the fallout, the exhausted employees, the agitated shoppers, and sometimes the truly unhinged situations that the holiday madness creates. The 3 nights I'm about to describe, all linked by the bizarre, consuming hunger of Black Friday, are the ones I can't shake. They're the real reason I stopped driving past midnight. The first call came in at 1:17 a.m., about 90 minutes after a major suburban electronics store, the kind with massive parking lots and even bigger expectations, was supposed to have opened its doors for the Black Friday rush. My current shift had been mostly quiet, a few tired people coming home from Thanksgiving dinner, a couple of late shift nurses. This ping, however, was strange. The pickup location wasn't at the main customer entrance or even the designated rideshare zone. It was a pin dropped deep in the labyrinthine service area, right next to the store's massive loading docks, the ones hidden behind a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. It was the kind of area you'd get arrested for loitering in. I hesitated, pulling my Toyota into the shadows of a vacant furniture store across the street. My internal creepo-meter was ticking, but the surge pricing was astronomical, and the destination was a high-end gated community an hour away. The money was simply too good to pass up. I circled the block and found the access gate was inexplicably ajar, not enough to be welcoming, but enough to squeeze a sedan through. The loading dock area was silent, save for the rhythmic thump-thump of the industrial refrigerators. The air smelled of cardboard, dust, and ozone. A single man, shivering violently despite the mild November air, was waiting next to a dumpster overflowing with mangled shipping pallets. He looked nothing like the frantic shoppers I'd expected. He wore a crisp, dark polo shirt with the store's logo embroidered on the chest, a cheap name tag that read Mark, and slacks. He was a manager, probably fresh off the floor, but his face was waxen. His eyes were wide and darting, and his hands gripped a worn olive green duffel bag like it contained the last oxygen mask on Earth. I pulled up, my headlights cutting through the grime. Mark didn't check the license plate or my name. He wrenched the passenger door open, dove in, and slammed it shut with a panicked force that rattled the whole car. "Go," he hissed, the word more air than sound. "Now, don't use the main exit, use the service road. It loops around the back." I found myself merging onto a poorly maintained access road meant for 18-wheelers. My curiosity was now fighting a full-blown flight response. "Sir, are you okay? Should I call a security guard?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Mark turned, and in the faint glow of the dash, I saw a bead of sweat track a path down his temple. He shoved a crumpled wad of hundreds into my center console. It was easily $500, maybe more, and the trip was maybe 90. "Listen to me," he whispered, leaning in so close I could smell stale coffee and fear. "That money is yours. Double it when we get there. But you have to promise me one thing. For the next hour, you are a ghost. You don't ask questions, you don't speak, you don't even think you saw me. You are just driving the directions I give you. Do you understand? I am paying you to be deaf and blind." The sheer desperation in his voice was horrifyingly convincing. I needed the money, and this felt less like a dangerous situation and more like a bizarre, high-stakes secret. I nodded slowly. "Service road. Then take a hard right onto Elmwood. Avoid the highway entrance." He rattled off a series of directions that were intentionally circuitous, leading us through residential areas, across back alleys, and down roads that hadn't seen a speed limit increase since the Nixon administration. It was a route designed to avoid cameras and main thoroughfares. It was the route of someone who believed they were being pursued. We drove in silence for 10 minutes. The only sound was the whir of the tires and Mark's shallow, ragged breathing. I caught him repeatedly checking the side mirror, then the back window, his eyes scanning the empty streets. "The list," he finally mumbled, startling me. He hadn't broken his self-imposed silence until now. "It's about the list." I kept my eyes glued to the road, remembering the rule. "Don't speak." He took my silence as a prompt. "I'm the assistant manager for logistics." My job, for the last 6 weeks, has been managing the Black Friday priority reservations. You know, the high-value stuff. The $5 40-inch TVs, the gaming consoles that don't actually exist until we open. Every year, certain customers get an unofficial reservation to avoid the stampedes. We call it the list. He paused, a nervous, high-pitched laugh escaping him. Except this year, the list wasn't for a consumer. It was for a collector. A bad one. Someone who runs operations in this city. He wanted a prototype gaming rig, only 3 in the country. He gave me a price, not in cash, but in protection. My blood went cold. Protection from what? The implication was chilling. I took the deal. I rerouted the stock. I made sure it was stashed. I thought I was safe. I thought once the doors opened, the chaos would cover it. I thought he'd just pick it up with his muscle, and I'd be done. Mark tightened his grip on the duffel bag, his knuckles white against the dark canvas. But the delivery didn't go through. Something went wrong. The floor staff. They screwed up the paperwork. It got tagged as lost in transit. And now he thinks I double-crossed him. He thinks I'm trying to sell it myself. Black Friday isn't about shopping anymore, Mark whispered, his voice trembling. It's about what people are willing to do to get what they want. And the crowd, the real crowd, is made up of people who see the chaos as a chance to collect their debts. We took a sharp turn onto a dark, tree-lined street. My headlights illuminated a flash of movement in my rearview mirror. A dark shape, low to the ground, maybe a car, but without its lights on. "They're here," Mark said, his voice flat with finality. "Stop the car." I stomped on the brakes. Mark fumbled with the clasp on the duffel bag, pulling out not a gun, but a small, heavy, metal box wrapped in cheap, brown butcher paper. "This is it," he choked out. "The real list. Not the reservation list. The employee ledger, who signed off on the shipment, who knew where it was. It protects me." He threw the bag into the street. "Drive! Don't look back!" I instinctively floored the accelerator, my tires squealing. I glanced in the mirror just as the dark shape of the car, which had been tracking us silently, slammed on its brakes next to the duffel bag. 2 figures, dressed in dark clothing, spilled out and pounced on it. They hadn't even noticed my car. They were focused entirely on the prize. They had wanted the bag, not the man. I drove like a maniac for the next 20 minutes, taking blind corners, blowing through stop signs on deserted streets. I was trying to create distance, but I was also just trying to outrun the knot of adrenaline and confusion in my stomach. Mark, meanwhile, hadn't moved. He was slumped against the window, clutching the heavy metal box, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The moment of action had passed, and it had left him empty, replaced by a suffocating, residual terror. "They'll know," he finally rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "They aren't stupid. That duffel bag was light. They know the weight of a gaming rig. They know the weight of a prototype. They went for the bag, though," I argued, trying to inject some logic into the situation, though I didn't believe it myself. "We saw them. They stopped for it. They'll be going through it now." Mark shook his head slowly. "You don't understand the kind of people I was dealing with. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was a collection. They wanted the item. If they didn't get the item, they want the next best thing. Leverage. And the leverage is the employee list. The names of the people who knew where the rig was stored." He held up the metal box, which was no bigger than a paperback novel. "This is the real list, the one that was in the safe. The names, the shifts, the access codes. It's leverage against the store. It's protection for me." The chilling realization hit me. The duffel bag wasn't a distraction. It was a test. The pursuers wanted to see if Mark would give up the wrong thing. By ditching the empty duffel, he had confirmed he had something else, something more valuable, because he was still running. "So, what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "We go to the drop point. The place I was supposed to meet the collector," Mark said, his voice now regaining a desperate urgency. "But we don't meet him. We ditch this box there. Make it look like I panicked and abandoned it. If they find the box at the original drop point, they'll believe I failed, but they won't believe I double-crossed them. It buys me time." The new destination was a nearly abandoned industrial park near the docks, an isolated, concrete wasteland. As we drove, Mark pulled out his phone, holding it in his trembling hands. He was navigating, but he was also doing something else. "I need to call my wife," he mumbled, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I need to tell her I love her, just in case." "No," I said sharply, my gut churning. "Don't use your phone. Not now. If they're tracking you, they're tracking the signal." Mark stared at the screen, a look of profound defeat washing over him. He slowly powered it off and dropped it into the cup holder. We were 3 minutes from the industrial park when the air in the cab changed. It wasn't the air itself, it was the atmosphere. I had been scanning my mirrors religiously, but I hadn't seen anything. Now, a faint, rhythmic pinging noise began to resonate from the back of the car. It was subtle, low, and persistent, like a very slow heartbeat. "What is that?" Mark whispered. I slowed down, listening intently. It was coming from the undercarriage. My mind immediately went to the cheap, off-brand GPS tracker you see in bad movies. But this was real. "I don't know," I lied, knowing exactly what it was. I was trapped. I was driving a beacon straight to the middle of a criminal transaction. I pulled into the desolate industrial park. It was a grid of empty, warehouse-sized buildings, dark and silent. Mark directed me to a loading bay for an old textiles factory that had been shuttered for a decade. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and stagnant water. "Stop here. Turn off the lights." "Give me a minute," he commanded, his eyes wide and panicked. I cut the engine. The silence was immediate and heavy. I could feel my own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Mark fumbled with the metal box. He tucked it deep into the dark space beneath an overturned concrete block, wiping his fingerprints on his slacks. "Okay, let's go." "Fast," he urged. I was about to restart the engine when Mark froze, his gaze fixed on the passenger side mirror. "The Ford," he breathed. "The pickup. It's here." Parked about 50 yards away, completely dark, was a truck matching the description of the one I'd seen the night before. The beat-up Ford with the rusty bumper. It hadn't followed us. It had been waiting for us. It had been the final destination all along. The driver's side door opened slowly. A figure emerged. He was tall, dressed in a heavy, military-style coat, and he moved with a slow, deliberate confidence that was more terrifying than any rush of violence. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried a small, sealed, white cooler, the kind EMTs use for sensitive transports. He didn't look at us. He walked straight past the front of my car, moving toward the spot where Mark had stashed the metal box. "He's not looking at us. He's looking for the box," Mark whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The collector reached the concrete block. He bent down, his shadow huge and distorted in the weak moonlight. He found the box. He picked it up. Then, he did something utterly terrifying. He didn't open it. He didn't check the contents. He simply looked up, straight at my car, and smiled a wide, chilling, completely unhurried smile. It was the smile of someone who knew the outcome of the game before the first piece was moved. He had known the whole time. The duffel bag, the chase, the panic it had all been a test to see what Mark valued more, the physical evidence, the list, or his own life. The collector walked back to his truck, placed the metal box carefully on the passenger seat, and then stopped. He didn't get in. He turned and pointed directly at my car, specifically at the back bumper. "Tell your friend," he shouted across the silent expanse, his voice echoing in the concrete emptiness. "Tell your friend to check the Black Friday special in his trunk." He got into his truck and drove away, slowly and deliberately. Mark and I sat there for a full minute, unable to move. Finally, Mark's survival instinct kicked in. He jumped out, ran to my trunk, and yanked it open. Tucked into the spare tire, well, next to the jack, was a single item. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't money. It was the prototype gaming rig, still in its original, unmarked shipping crate. The very item Mark had been trying to ditch all night. Mark's face went white. The collector hadn't been hunting the list for leverage. He had been proving a point. He had the power to put the item in the car, or remove it, at any time. He just wanted Mark to suffer the fear of the chase. The real list was in the metal box, and the prototype was a souvenir. He wanted me to drive his property across state lines. Mark stammered, his eyes wide. He just wanted me to be the courier, knowing I was terrified the whole time. And he put it in your car. He shoved the crate into my hands. "Get rid of this, now. Drop me off and lose it, sell it, burn it. I don't care. Just get it out of my sight. I drove Mark home, dropped him off at the gate to his gated community, and drove away without saying a word. I still had the crate in my trunk. I drove for 2 more hours, finally pulling over at a rest stop. I took the prototype rig out, looked at the anonymous box, and left it sitting on top of a newspaper dispenser, knowing that it would be gone by dawn, claimed by the next desperate soul who couldn't resist a Black Friday mystery. I sold my car a week later. I couldn't shake the persistent, nagging fear that the collector, or someone on his other list, still had the frequency of the tracker I never found. I was never a driver. I was just a disposable asset in a high-stakes delivery, and all because I was available for an unauthorized Black Friday pickup. My experience with Black Friday isn't just limited to the gig driving. One year, long before I drove for Uber, my younger brother, Ken, worked security at the local suburban mall, a sprawling, 2-story behemoth, affectionately and accurately nicknamed the Concrete Tomb. This was the year of the Great Black Friday Stamping Incident, an event the local news managed to quietly sweep under the rug, but which I remember with crystalline, suffocating clarity. Ken had pulled a double shift that Thanksgiving, and he'd called me around 10:30 p.m., asking me to bring him a fresh thermos of coffee and a hot meal before the midnight doors opened. "Don't come in the main entrance, though," he'd warned over the phone, his voice tight. "The line is already insane. They're going to use the main doors. Just park out back, and I'll meet you at the employee entrance in 30. When I arrived, the mall's parking lot was a spectacle of human anticipation. Thousands of cars, mostly old sedans and minivans, were parked haphazardly. Their owners camped out in a line that snaked halfway around the building. I managed to park near the main entrance just to get a lay of the land before heading to the back. That's when I saw it. The crowd at the main vestibule. The main entrance was a double set of glass doors, separated by a 10-foot deep, enclosed, carpeted vestibule, the kind designed to keep the heat in and the cold out. The line outside was orderly, but the people pressed into that vestibule were not. They were packed. Not tightly, but dangerously tightly. It was only 11:15 p.m., 45 minutes before opening, and the volume of humanity pushing forward had already completely filled the space between the outer, locked exit doors and the inner, still locked mall doors. It wasn't the noise that got me, but the lack of it. There was no festive chatter, no cheerful banter, just a dense, silent mass of coat-clad bodies, their faces reflecting the harsh sodium vapor light of the parking lot. They looked less like shoppers and more like a single, unified organism, their collective will focused entirely on the aluminum frame of the inner doors. I called Ken, leaning against a pillar, maybe 50 feet away. "Ken, this is crazy. The line management is terrible. The vestibule is going to burst," I muttered into the phone. Ken's voice was stressed. "I know. We're arguing with mall management right now. They think the pressure cooker effect keeps the crowd manageable. Idiots. Just give me 5 minutes. I'm trying to get maintenance to reinforce the inner doors before the clock hits 12. I hung up, uneasy. I started to walk away, toward the employee entrance, but something pulled me back. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the sheer, unsettling density of the crowd. Then, the press began. It didn't start with a surge. It started with a slow, agonizing sigh. From the back of the line, a few hundred feet out, the people began to inch forward, responding to a silent, collective countdown that only they could hear. This forward motion translated into an unstoppable, hydraulic pressure on the bodies in the vestibule. I saw a woman near the front, maybe 30, clutching a cheap, collapsible stroller. Her face was contorted in a silent scream as the pressure pinned her against the outer glass doors. She tried to lift the stroller, which held a sleeping toddler, but she couldn't move her arms. The sound that followed was not the sudden, sharp crash of breaking glass. It was worse. It was a prolonged, groaning tear. The entire frame of the outer double doors, the ones meant for exit only, the ones that were never meant to take pressure, inward rippled. The latch mechanism gave way, and the outer glass, already warped, blew outward in an awful, low-frequency explosion of compressed air, not unlike a deep-sea pipe bursting. A few people, those closest to the break, were instantly sucked out into the cold night air, tumbling onto the sidewalk. This momentary relief was a disaster. The tiny vacuum created by the sudden breach allowed the crowd behind to surge into the newly available space. The woman with the stroller went down, her scream finally breaking free. A thin, panicked sound instantly drowned out by the shouts and confusion of the people pushing over her. The sound had changed. It was no longer the silent press of anticipation. It was the ragged, desperate sound of human beings fighting for air, for space, and for a chance to get through the next set of doors. I was paralyzed for a second, then adrenaline slammed into me. I lunged forward, trying to reach the woman, but the force of the crowd, now a chaotic, roaring wave, hit me. I was shoved against the concrete pillar I had been leaning on just moments before. I could no longer move my legs. I was just another piece of material, pressed by the unthinking, terrifying force of a stampede that hadn't even started its race. I looked up, into the chaos of the vestibule. Through the inner glass doors, I could see Ken, his face pale and contorted, shouting frantically into a headset. He saw me, pinned against the pillar, trapped by the human surge. His eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing fear. The wave of humanity that surged into the vestibule was not driven by anger or malice. It was driven by pure, singular focus. The pressure was a physical, measurable force, the weight of hundreds of bodies, compressed into a 10-foot space, all trying to occupy the same square inch of floor. I was pressed so hard against the concrete pillar that I couldn't draw a full breath. My chest was seized, and a frantic, high-pitched ringing started in my ears. I could see the woman with the stroller maybe 6 feet away, now completely submerged beneath the rising tide of dark winter coats. I could hear a muffled, terrifying snap, the sound of the cheap plastic stroller collapsing under the impossible weight, followed by an immediate, chilling silence. Panic was no longer a thought. It was an electric current running through my muscles. My mind, however, detached. It became purely analytical. I have to get free, or I will be part of the floor. I looked up again, finding Ken's terrified face through the inner glass doors. He was shouting, but the sound was muted by the heavy doors, and the collective roar of the crowd was drowning him out. He looked like he was fighting his own battle, being held back by a few older security guards who were desperately trying to keep the inner door from bowing in. I had one move. The space between the pillar and the wall was maybe 18 inches too narrow to move sideways, but maybe enough to create a slight angle. I put my palms flat against the pillar, found a tiny purchase with the heels of my shoes, and used the last of my trapped breath to push myself out, not away from the crowd, but into it, sideways, trying to burrow. It was like pushing against wet sand. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the man pressed against my back, shifted his weight slightly, instinctively trying to get forward. In that microsecond of relief, I shoved myself with every ounce of power I had, angling my body out into the main current of the crowd. I wasn't free. I was simply in a different kind of danger. I was no longer pinned, but I was swept up, unable to control my direction or speed. I was a leaf in a flash flood. My feet barely touched the ground. I was carried forward toward the broken outer doors. I saw the woman's collapsed stroller, now completely flattened, being kicked and dragged along like a piece of refuse. There was no sign of the toddler or the woman. The crowd was moving over them, oblivious to the tragedy beneath their feet. I fought with a primal ferocity, using my elbows to carve out a shallow pocket of air around my head. I was screaming, but no one heard me. Every face I saw was a mask of cold, single-minded determination. They weren't angry. They were simply hungry. They had waited too long, and now the barrier was gone. Finally, I was propelled through the gaping, jagged hole where the outer doors had been. I hit the sidewalk hard, skidding on the cold concrete, my shoulders slamming against a parking meter. The cold night air was a shock, and I sucked it down, gasping for breath. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, watching the terrifying scene. The crowd continued to pour out of the broken vestibule doors like a physical extrusion, a constant, unstoppable stream that flowed into the parking lot, already forming new, frenzied lines at the secondary, less guarded entrances. They didn't stop to help the few people still struggling on the sidewalk, including the ones who had been thrown clear. They just kept moving toward the next entry point. I found my legs and ran toward the employee entrance, the meal and coffee I was carrying, long forgotten. Ken was standing just inside, the back door metal already unbolted, his face streaked with tears and grime. He didn't even speak. He just pulled me inside, slamming the heavy steel door shut and bolting it. "I saw you," he choked out. leaning against the door, shaking. I saw them. They ran right over. We both knew what he meant. The next hour was chaos. Sirens blared. EMTs, overwhelmed by the injuries, broken limbs, contusions, and crushing injuries, were forced to triage the scene from a safe distance, unable to penetrate the persistent, moving crowd. Later, huddled in the back supply room, waiting for the police report to be filed, Ken showed me the surveillance footage from the vestibule. It was worse than I remembered. The mall manager, desperate to avoid a full-scale riot, had made a decision. 10 minutes before the scheduled midnight opening, he had unlocked the inner doors, the ones leading into the mall, but only cracked them open about 6 inches, just enough to show the crowd that access was imminent. He thought it would calm them down, Ken whispered, his eyes glued to the screen. He wanted to give them a taste. The psychological impact of that tiny opening was immediate and catastrophic. The crowd, seeing their goal within reach, surged with a terrifying, unified power. The outer doors broke not because of a riot, but because of the collective, unthinking will of the people trying to squeeze through an impossibly small gap. Then Ken showed me the final, haunting detail. He zoomed in on the inner doors, the ones he was guarding. The video was grainy, but clear enough. Just as the outer doors burst, the crowd pressed against the inner doors so hard that the cheap aluminum frame warped inward. A small gap, no wider than a finger, appeared where the 2 doors met. In that tiny gap, where the force of hundreds of people was being channeled, a crumpled piece of paper was slowly pushed out. It was a cheaply printed flyer. The flyer was a coupon, not for a TV or a gaming console or a toy. It was for a free flu shot from the mall pharmacy, redeemable between 12 a.m. and 12:05 a.m. on Black Friday. A timed, loss leader health promotion. The crowd wasn't fighting for a 60-inch TV. They were fighting, killing, for a negligible, disposable commodity, advertised with a manufactured sense of scarcity. The sheer absurdity of the sacrifice for such a meager reward, the willingness of hundreds of people to risk everything for a 5-minute window on a free shot, was the true psychological horror. The item didn't matter. The artificial scarcity was the key. The news called it a bottleneck accident and blamed the poor design of the vestibule. But Ken and I knew the truth. We had seen what happened when the manufactured hunger of Black Friday met the human need to be first. I never looked at a crowded space the same way again. Every line, every packed subway car, every full elevator became a potential catastrophe. I always found myself searching for the nearest pillar, the nearest exit, acutely aware of the collective, unthinking weight of the human mass. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that awful, muffled snap of the stroller, a sound instantly buried beneath the roar of the hungry, moving crowd. My third story from the Black Friday circuit takes place a year later. I had gotten out of rideshare driving and taken a part-time job delivering pharmaceutical supplies. It was an overnight gig, less money, but less contact with the kind of instability the retail holidays brought out. This story starts not on Black Friday, but late Thanksgiving night, around 3 a.m., in the middle of nowhere, halfway between 2 small, nondescript towns that were 20 years behind the rest of the state. I was low on gas, and the only place open on that stretch of highway was a battered, solitary 24-hour convenience store called The Last Stop. The store had the eerie, fluorescent glow of a place that exists purely out of necessity, not commerce. The parking lot was empty save for my small delivery van and a beat-up Ford pickup with a rusty bumper. The single clerk behind the counter looked like he hadn't slept since the previous Black Friday. I pumped my gas and walked inside, grabbing a lukewarm coffee. The store was silent. The clerk, a young man with a name tag that read Jerry, just nodded, eyes glazed over. Before I could pay, my work phone vibrated a private message. Not a call, from an unknown number. I am the one waiting for a ride. Do not talk to Jerry. Do not look in the mirrors. Triple the standard fare. Meet me in the back. My stomach twisted. This was exactly the kind of unsettling, high-risk nonsense I'd sworn off. I looked at Jerry, who was staring fixedly at the display of expired hot dogs. He was either oblivious or in on it. I paid for my coffee, and with a growing dread, walked to the back of the store, toward the restrooms and the rarely used storage area. The door to the storage room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. Inside, huddled between racks of bulk toilet paper and cases of bottled water, was a man in his late 20s. He was thin, wearing a greasy mechanic's jumpsuit, and looked like he was about to vomit. His eyes were wide, and his hands were shaking violently as he clutched a crumpled piece of paper. "Are you Leo?" I asked, keeping my voice low. I had to use the name from the text exchange. He flinched as if I had shouted, "Yes. Get me out of here. Right now. I'll pay cash." He scrambled past me and bolted for the front door, not even looking at Jerry. I followed, confused and highly suspicious. We got into my delivery van, which felt exposed and unprofessional for this kind of rendezvous. Leo directed me not to his town, but to a small, isolated cabin 50 miles further down the highway. A triple fare, as promised. He immediately counted out $400 onto the center console, far exceeding the estimate. "Just drive. And please, just keep the interior dark. And don't look behind us for 10 minutes. I mean it." He sounded like a hostage. I did as instructed, pulling out of the lot, resisting the urge to check my mirrors. The silence was agonizing. After about 5 miles of dark highway punctuated by the rustling of his jumpsuit, he finally started talking, his voice a strained, low monotone. "I work for the company that contracts the cleaning crew for that store. Thanksgiving is always a mess. Employee party, customers, spilling soda, whatever. I was doing the final sweep, cleaning out the display cases, when I saw it." He held up the crumpled paper he'd been clutching. It wasn't standard receipt paper. It was a piece of high-quality, watermarked linen, the kind used for legal documents. It was tucked, folded, inside the condensation drain of the big walk-in display freezer. The one they keep the frozen turkeys in. Someone wanted to make sure it wasn't found easily. Leo slowly unfolded the paper in the faint glow of the dash. It wasn't a receipt for a discounted TV. It wasn't an IOU. It was a bizarre, clinical document, half handwritten, half typed, titled Acquisition Agreement. The document detailed a transaction. It named a payee, a shell corporation registered out of a P.O. box in the next state. It named a price, a staggering 6-figure sum, and the item being transacted wasn't electronics or merchandise. It was simply listed as 1 unit type O negative. Below that, scrawled in thick black ink, were 2 dates. The delivery date, which was stamped as Black Friday 0800 HRS, and the recipient name, which was a single common American name, like John Smith. I froze. I knew what I was looking at. This wasn't a joke. People talk about the black market for Black Friday, but this was the real black market. A human market, Leo said, his voice cracking. I put it in my pocket, I finished my shift, and I tried to leave. He stopped, taking a deep, shuddering breath. As I was driving out, I saw him, a man, walking into the last stop parking lot. He wasn't in a car, he was on foot, and he was wearing one of those cheap, smiling mascot costumes, like an off-brand Thanksgiving turkey or something. Featureless, a huge grin, vacant eyes. I pulled over. I watched. He walked straight past the front entrance, right to the walk-in freezer door on the side of the building, and he just stood there, staring at the little window like he knew the paper was gone, like he knew I had it. He was looking for his contract. The drive to the isolated cabin was conducted in a nerve-shredding silence. Leo was huddled against the passenger door, the acquisition agreement clutched in his hand like a lifeline. I was resisting the urge to check my mirrors, but every instinct was screaming at me that we were being followed by the turkey. The silence of the highway felt like a coiled threat. "The cabin," Leo finally said, his voice raw. "It's my grandfather's hunting cabin. Nobody goes there. It's the only place I could think of." "What do you think is in that contract, Leo?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "It says O negative. That's the most universally used blood type, and the price, 6 figures. It's too high for blood. I think it's a person, a delivery. And the walk-in freezer is just a temporary transfer point. Black Friday morning, 8 a.m., that's when the traffic is the most chaotic, the perfect time for a high-risk delivery." He paused, running a hand over his face. "This town has a massive distribution center for a major retail chain. They bring in trucks from everywhere for the rush. It would be easy to smuggle something in, transfer it at a remote, off-the-books place like The Last Stop, and then have a final courier take it to the buyer. The thought was paralyzing. A human being, treated as one unit, being transferred as a piece of Black Friday inventory. The cold, corporate language of the document made the crime infinitely worse. Then, we saw the light. Up ahead, maybe a quarter-mile away, the highway was briefly illuminated by a flash of yellow-orange. It wasn't a car headlight. It was a single, stationary light, high off the ground, like a security floodlight trained directly on the road. "That's not normal," Leo whispered. "There's nothing out here but trees." I slowed the van, my heart sinking. As we got closer, I realized the light was coming from a sign. A temporary, professionally printed sign, stuck into the dirt shoulder, with a massive, stylized arrow pointing down a muddy, unpaved service road. The sign read, "Black Friday Specials, this way." And beneath the text, a crudely drawn, oversized image of the smiling turkey mascot. "They knew where I was going," Leo said, his voice cracking. "They didn't track the van, they tracked me. They set a trap on the only road to the cabin." I slammed on the brakes. The service road looked dark and deep. There was no way I was driving into that. "What now?" I demanded. Leo looked at the paper, then out at the dark woods. A moment of true panic washed over his face. "We go back to The Last Stop. It's too late for the highway. The collector has everything locked down." Part 3. The unit. I did a high-speed U-turn on the deserted highway and floored it back toward the convenience store. The fear was a tangible, electric thing in the cab. We were racing against the clock, against a professional operation, and against an unnerving man in a turkey costume. We reached The Last Stop in 20 minutes. It was now 4:15 a.m. The store was still glowing, still alone. Jerry, the clerk, was exactly where I left him, staring at the hot dogs. The Ford pickup was gone. The side door. The walk-in freezer. Leo gasped. If they're using it as a drop-off, there might be a tracker, or a message, or another unit. We crept around the side of the building. The industrial walk-in freezer was massive, humming loudly. It had a heavy, latching door and a small, reinforced glass window near the top. Leo pulled himself up to look through the window. He was completely silent for a long moment. Then he slowly, deliberately, slid back down, his eyes wide and vacant. "What is it?" I whispered. "It's empty. Cleaned out," he breathed. "Except for a little blood. On the floor. And a cooler." He pointed to a small, professional-grade, sealed white cooler identical to the one the collector in the first story had carried. It was sitting just inside the freezer door. "The unit is gone. They took the delivery, but they left a receipt." Leo, trembling, reached into his jumpsuit pocket, pulled out a small metallic object, and pressed it against the freezer door handle. It was a small, high-powered magnet. The internal lock clicked. He pushed the heavy door open. The blast of cold air was shocking. Inside, the cooler was indeed sitting on the floor. Taped to the lid of the cooler was a small, crisp, laminated label. I leaned in to read the label. It was not a medical label. It was a generic barcode label, the kind you would find on retail merchandise. The text was simple. Item, Unit 1. ONEG location. The Last Stop. Status, acquired. Black Friday special. My breath hitched. The horror wasn't the transaction. The horror was the normalization of the transaction. They had treated the crime like a simple inventory transfer. Leo pointed at the wall, just above the cooler. There, scrawled in thick, black marker, was a message. Black Friday is not about deals. It's about demand. Don't touch the inventory. As we were staring at the chilling message, the heavy steel back door to the main store creaked open. We both whirled around. Standing in the dark doorway was the figure from the highway, the mascot, a massive, smiling, vacant-eyed turkey, its cheap synthetic feathers matted and dirty. It wasn't moving aggressively. It was just standing there, filling the frame of the doorway, its head tilted slightly. The turkey's hand slowly lifted, pointing at Leo's trembling hand, which was still holding the acquisition agreement. "You touched the inventory," a voice said, low and distorted. coming from inside the turkey's head. The voice was calm, almost bored. The terror wasn't the threat of violence. It was the realization that this person was completely indifferent to our lives. We were simply an inventory control issue. Leo's eyes darted around. He made a desperate choice. He shoved the crumpled paper into my hand, then bolted, running not for the van, but for the dark woods behind the store. "Go, drive," he screamed. The turkey didn't follow Leo. It took 2 slow, deliberate steps out of the shadow of the doorway and began to walk toward me. Not running, walking. It knew it could catch me. Its only focus was the paper in my hand. I didn't think. I sprinted. I got to the van, slammed the door shut, and mashed the accelerator. I spun out of the lot, tires squealing, leaving a black smear on the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, the turkey was standing exactly where I left it, its gigantic, smiling head perfectly framed in the center of my view, the single, bright fluorescent light of the last stop shining down on its indifferent face. It hadn't chased me. It was waiting for me to leave. I drove until the sunrise, clutching the contract. I ended up burning it, piece by piece, in a drum fire at a desolate junkyard, watching the crisp, watermarked linen curl and dissolve into black ash. I never saw Leo again. I checked the news for weeks for any mention of a disappearance or a body, but there was nothing. Just the endless chatter about Black Friday deals and the records broken for consumer spending. The only thing I have left is the persistent image of that smiling, indifferent mascot and the horrifying, bureaucratic certainty of the contract. It proved that for some people, Black Friday wasn't about the economy. It was about supply and demand, and some inventory is far more valuable than a TV.